Monday. I took this entire week off because I didn't know what was what. And then once I knew that everything was good, I scheduled National Night Out in Berks County tonight. There's like 5 or 6 towns that have National Night Out. They start at 5 o'clock. And so I figured I'd come up early and just schedule something. Whether there's 40 people here or 4,000, you can only answer so many questions in an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so thank you all for being here today. I will get to as many of these questions as I possibly can. And with that, I don't think that there's any other housekeeping matters on my end. What may happen here as I go through these questions is if I get a question like later on that's similar to one earlier on, I may just sort of read it and say I already addressed that. And then we'll see how much time we have left over, and we'll just sort of take it from there. Donna, where's the water?
Hello, Brian, Representative Brian, thank you for having me today. And my question is, in lieu of the fact that Trump and his agenda was voted in this November, and part of that agenda was Obama repealing and replacing Obamacare. I thought that perhaps that would be a message sent to Congress that the American people want their voices heard by Congress to repeal and replace Obamacare. That's a big part of why Trump was elected, and that's a big part of the will of the people, which recently you had voted against repealing Obamacare. And also the fact that it's hurting lots of people who are members. And I was wondering why people who are members of Congress who refuse to repeal and replace Obamacare are protected from this damaging impact of their inaction, and why shouldn't Congress have to follow their own laws that they pass? Why is Congress exempt and allowed to be exempt by calling themselves a small business with less than 50 members from Obamacare?
Okay, thank you, Donna. So there's obviously, when you unravel that question, there's a bunch of pieces to it. Let me answer like the last part first, because I think it's quick, it's simple, and then your broader question about repealing and replacing is obviously multifaceted, and there's a lot of pieces to it. I wasn't there when the ACA was passed into law, and I recall there was some sort of deal cut by some senator that exempted staff and senior staff from the Affordable Care Act. But I have to tell you, from my perspective, if you are in the employer-sponsored healthcare marketplace, which is about 50% of the entire country, then if you're around here, I have Blue Cross Blue Shield. I pay it, like every single month. When the premiums go up every year, I pay it just like everyone else. So there's not any exemption on that. But what you also may be referencing is something that has been in the news. When the Senate tried to pass the skinny repeal last week, it did not impact congressional members or their staff's health care, and that was because the rules of reconciliation didn't allow that exemption to be overridden. So that was just because of the Senate rules about reconciliation, which is definitely very in the weeds. I don't know all the rules of reconciliation. I know some of them, but that's the short answer to that. Now, the broader question of healthcare reform, and there's probably a lot of questions in here on healthcare reform, and I don't want anyone to think that just by virtue of me answering this question about healthcare reform that like no more questions about healthcare reform, because there's just a lot to it. And there are intermittent healthcare policy questions related to what happens this year, because the president continues to threaten withholding CSR payments, cost sharing reductions, which if that were to happen, a lot of people, low-income, middle-income Americans, literally would not be able to purchase health care insurance. You then have the longer-term policy questions related to how do you deal with the shortcomings of the Affordable Care Act, specifically as it relates to financing the healthcare system. Because I'm sure that there are people here that fully support the Affordable Care Act, right? Some people raise your hand if you fully support. Okay, that's fine. Most people, a lot of people here. The reality is, what's going to happen here? The reason that this individual and small group insurance marketplace is deteriorating is because there's not a sufficient amount of money to pay for it. And also because the Obama administration decided to hold off implementation of the Cadillac tax, which is a tax on health insurance plans that are valued over a certain threshold, as well as delayed implementation of medical device tax. So, as a consequence of that, there are intermittent things, policy-wise, that you have to do. Otherwise, whether you want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act entirely, whether you want to fix it, whether you just want to put more money into it, the reality is there are some things that need to be done right now, or otherwise, as new insurance plans come out in October-ish, if you're under an employer-sponsored plan, then you're probably going to have your employer come in and say, okay, here are your plan options, here's what it's going to cost. And what was the case over the past 6 years, to the frustration of many, I think, and I was at a small little law firm in Pottstown and Phoenixville, and this happened, where you have a good year, you want to give employees bonuses, and then you realize, oh, well, cost of healthcare is going to go up 12, 15% next year. So yes, you get a bonus, but what it's going to cost you to pay for your healthcare either washes out your bonus or cuts into what your raise might be, not bonus, your raise might be. So, as to the larger policy healthcare questions, I have always said that whether you repeal and replace or whether you fix, it doesn't matter to me in as much as improving the healthcare system that we have and making it more stable, because it is not sustainable for our healthcare system to have 12, 15, 20% insurance premium increases every single year. I mean, it's just simply not. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And some of the reasons that health insurance costs continue to escalate actually have to do with what the cost of health care is. And with what we're doing right now, which are the rules of reconciliation, which it was all oriented around trying to pass something out of the Senate with only 51 votes, not 60, you can't even address a lot of what drives healthcare costs in this country with what we're doing right now. So it's been to the frustration of many. I know that there's at least one physician here who probably would say, what frustrates me, and what maybe frustrates some of you when we're talking about healthcare costs, is we're not even talking about some of the real cost drivers of healthcare when you're doing healthcare reform. And that's because we're not, because that was not able to be in the healthcare reform package. So there's a whole set of healthcare cost escalators that we're not able to address in this bill that I think that we should address. Finally, as it relates to repeal and replace, I am open to that, but only if the essential health benefits, which deals with the 10 mandatory coverage protections, maternity care, mental health coverage, ambulatory care, prescription drug coverage, there's 4 or 5 other ones. To me, they have to be in every single health insurance policy, because if they're not, here's what's going to happen. A year from now or 2 years from now, low-income Americans all across this country who literally can't afford to take vacations, right? They might be late on their car payment. They probably have a rent payment that they may not be able to make. If they want health care insurance, you know what they're going to do? They're going to be forced into the lowest option. And what happens when you're forced into the basement option is when you get sick or when you get rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, or your child has a mental health condition, or you have a mental health condition, whatever the case may be, you may not be covered for that, which means the hospital's still going to take care of you and it's just going to get thrown into the bad debt pot, which means we still pay for it anyway. Whereas if you look at what the cost of each one of those essential health benefits costs are within the broader spectrum of a healthcare insurance policy, maternity care coverage is 2% of the cost of a healthcare insurance policy. And all of us were born, right? And we all have kids, and we all have grandkids, or I don't have grandkids yet. But the point is, like, some of this stuff, in order to have a fundamental baseline of what our healthcare system is, I think the essential health benefits is smart healthcare policy, right? Those are Obamacare mandates. The same goes for pre-existing conditions. Now, if you do not have pre-existing conditions coverage, what's going to happen is you're going to have what's known as market segregation. If you're healthy, you get thrown in this pile. Okay, you get cheap insurance, or you get nothing's cheap, right? You get less expensive healthcare policies. But if you become sick or you have a pre-existing condition, and let's be honest, sometimes you don't know you have a pre-existing condition until it's diagnosed. And so even President Trump, as he was running for office, said, we're going to protect those with pre-existing condition. the healthcare bill that I voted on out of committee, which I still felt needed improvements, which then weren't made, which is why I didn't vote for it on the floor, we had protection for pre-existing conditions, which then got stripped out of there when they created the waiver program. So I think most people think that protection for pre-existing conditions is smart policy. So if you have a repeal that has a replacement with those protections in it, then I am open-minded to it. But you can't. But what I would say though is, well, you're saying it's socialized medicine. Well,
I'm sorry.
that's fine. We all have our opinions. I think that ultimately, what I do not think is smart policymaking is to repeal it now and replace it later. I think that is severe market disruption. Look, we're dealing with people's lives, right? So, I'm totally mindful that some of you that are clapping now might not clap the next answer that I have for the next question. But the point is, when it comes to healthcare policy, you're dealing with, it's the most fundamental personal thing in every single one of our lives. And so when you are addressing it, you have to, number one, provide certainty, right? Because if you're not providing certainty, all you know what breaks loose. And when insurance companies come out with policies next year, they may decide they're not going to even offer policies. And that's my concern with pulling back the cost sharing reductions, is if you do that, you're going to see a lot of insurance companies leave the marketplace. That's an opening salvo on some of the questions that you asked on.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Yes.
You're going to get a real close to your mouth.
Congratulations on two things. Number one, that you're having this town meeting and that you are communicating with your constituents, because a lot of the legislators are not doing that, or that's dwindling these days.
Amen.
And also on your new addition to...
My little lady.